Hey, Dog Nation, it's Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, and here is my one promise for you today. I believe that our show is going to be more exciting than last night's Super Bowl. Hopefully there'll be more action. I can't promise you about points scored and whatnot, but I do believe that we have a chance to put together a more entertaining product than what happened for most of the night last night in Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. Of course, if you're a Patriots fan, you're happy, but for most of the rest of the public, there seemed to be a lack of excitement, energy, entertainment, so we'll try to provide that for you today. It's Chip Towers later on. It was actually a really good weekend for Georgia, all things considered. Some recruiting stuff will hit. Obviously, great news about Champ Bailey going into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Not a surprise necessarily, but certainly a really good celebration for one of the all-time great defensive backs in a Georgia uniform. And, of course, a handful of former Dogs now get a chance to hoist the Lombardi Trophy. In some cases, again, that's exciting stuff, and we'll talk about it all as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Last night's Super Bowl left me with two questions, and I think they're relevant for Georgia, and in a couple of minutes I want to get into both of them. We'll do that here on DawgNation Daily. Before that, obviously, when you have a big event like the Super Bowl, it has a tendency to almost, suck the life out of every other story, and every other potential piece of news gets almost swallowed up by the attention paid to the Super Bowl. So I want to make sure we start with what else was going on this weekend, recruiting as we head towards National Signing Day on Wednesday. If you were not paying attention to that enough this weekend because you were looking to the big game on Sunday, let me give you an idea of a few of the things that happened. I think this is potentially, in some cases, pretty interesting for UGA. We will deal with that, and then I'll get to the Super Bowl storyline involving UGA in just a moment. First of all, I couldn't help but notice on Friday it was four-star wide receiver, current Ole Miss commit, Jonathan Mingo, tweeted out a push pin. I think we have that, a push pin of himself in Athens, Georgia. So here we are in this final weekend before National Signing Day. Georgia obviously busy entertaining a guy that's a pretty impressive prospect, committed to an SEC school. That's an in-state situation for him at Ole Miss, so there's a geographic tie for the Rebels, but nonetheless, Georgia gets a chance to host Jonathan Mingo. Now, you can debate for yourself for a moment. If Georgia's hosting Mingo, what does that mean for George Pickens? I don't know. That's obviously a pretty complicated situation, as we've chronicled. What does that mean for Lawrence Cager, who I guess was also on campus this weekend, too? At least that was the expectation was going to be, that the Miami transfer was going to be in town. Does Georgia favor the transfer route? Does it favor the high school four-star prospect? Which one do you want? Different people are going to have different opinions when it comes to this. I was saying before the show began to Connor Riley, Michael Carvel, our producers, that if you gave me the choice of, do you take the graduate transfer who's put up some stats? Do you take the four-star high school guy? I think for what Georgia needs right now, my preference would be more along the lines of Cager. My preference would be more along the lines of a guy that's put up some stats in big-time college football. That would just be my preference for Georgia right now. Doesn't mean that I don't like Mingo. Doesn't mean that I wouldn't like to see Georgia do that. But I'm also keeping in mind that there is a good bit of wide receiver depth in the class of 2020. If you're looking for that game-changing prospect signed out of high school, it may be better that you get that guy in 2020 than in 2019 right now. But nonetheless, it was certainly interesting that Georgia hosted Mingo, because the one thing that I keep getting a lot of comments from you all to me on social media about is the conversation that we've been having here now for quite some time about Georgia's need to upgrade the wide receiver position. Georgia's need to make wide receiver look like a destination. Obviously, we've already seen some 2020 guys seemingly question Georgia as a destination there in that regard. In some cases, prospects have just flat out chosen another school. Obviously, Georgia missed out on Jaden Hazelwood for the class of 2019. That's a pretty big miss when you're talking about an in-state wide receiver, and George Pickens, whatever may still happen with that. From that standpoint, getting Mingo on campus was at least a step in the right direction there in that regard. And what my hope is on all of this is that eventually guys at that position, whether it be Mingo or Cager or Pickens or Hazelwood or Jermaine Burton for the 2020 class or anybody else, my hope is they really will buy into and listen to what A.J. Green, the great former five-star wide receiver, who didn't play for Kirby Smart, who didn't play for this coaching staff, that's for sure, but as a fan of the Georgia Bulldogs and obviously a guy that was a part of this program at one point in time, when we had him on the show on Friday, he said, no matter how much Georgia may runs the football, no matter how much Georgia may be building itself around this big offensive lineman, this can still be a place where wide receivers can take advantage of that opportunity in the offense because you're going to get some one-on-one opportunities. In fact, here's what A.J. Green said about that on Friday. And my hope is, whether you're talking about, late additions to the 2019 class, graduate transfers, elite prospects for the 2020 class, one way or another, Georgia needs more of these receivers. Mingo might be a name to consider there, but hopefully all these guys consider what A.J. Green said on Friday. Here's a reminder.
Oh, of course, yeah. You just got to capitalize on your opportunities whenever it's called. But, I feel like young kids these days, they all want to be in that 5-receiver offense, getting a lot of balls, getting 100 balls. But, sometimes it's just, if you got a great offensive line, great running backs, man, you get a lot of one-on-one out there. So I think if any receiver you want to come to Georgia, it's a great opportunity.
So I hope that guys like Jonathan Mingo listen to that carefully. And I think Georgia fans will have an interesting discussion when they think about this position and those remaining roster spots for 2019, scholarship spots for the 2019 class, overall, ways of getting to the 85 in general. Which kind of wide receiver addition do UGA fans favor? Is it a guy like Cage or is it a guy like Mingo? I think that's a pretty interesting conversation we had. But that's not the only piece of interesting recruiting news over the weekend, too, that I want to make sure we hit here on DawgNation Daily off the top. First of all, as we discussed a little bit last week, Nick Cross did choose to give his final official visit to Penn State. In fact, on Instagram, he showed some evidence of that being in Happy Valley. But before he goes out there, apparently, there you go on video right now. You see the photo of him in Happy Valley in the Beaver Stadium in the background. He's wearing the full white Penn State uniform. I gotta say, that does not really work for me in terms of, hey, get excited about coming here and wearing this uniform. Something about that bland white uniform, it almost seems like the uniform you'd wear in a practice situation more so, or like a workout, more so than an actual big-time college football uniform. But Cross does take the official visit to Penn State. But before that, apparently, according to Cross's own Instagram, and as had been reported by Rivals.com last week, Cross was taking apparently an unofficial visit to UGA on his Instagram account. Now, that's a uniform. That's a uniform that gets you excited right there. Nick Cross stopping by UGA before heading to Happy Valley in time to get a couple pictures there and get focused in on what Georgia might want to tell him and on an unofficial basis before he takes the official visit to Penn State. So does that keep Georgia in play for Cross, who's committed to Florida State and obviously choosing to give the final official visit weekend to Penn State? Jeff Sintel said some interesting things about that as of late. Our recruiting insider at DawgNation.com. I'll invite you to make sure you read everything that Jeff writes over the next couple of days as Georgia closes out this 2019 class. But as a reminder, when we first found out that Cross would be taking the official visit to Penn State, which he did do over the weekend, Jeff kind of pumped the brakes on us a little bit, saying, hey, don't be so quick to assume that eliminates Georgia just because of that official visit situation. What Jeff said then seems more prophetic now, given the fact that Cross did indeed take apparently his unofficial visit to Georgia this weekend. But as a reminder, a little more context on Cross, here's what Jeff said on this in the past.
I think in his heart, and if he wants to go to Georgia, I think to pull Georgia, there are other schools here aside.
So it's really interesting from Jeff. He says if Cross wants to go to Georgia, he's seen enough and he's gotten enough info from UGA, and the additional unofficial visit gives him even more to think about in that regard. But Jeff also gives us a pretty stern reminder at the end that this is not just Georgia versus Penn State. You've still got to think about the school that he's committed to, Florida State. You've still got to think about them potentially being involved in all of this. So a lot to think about with this four-star defensive back, Nick Cross, a name we've talked about a lot by now over the last couple of weeks. And at the very least, it's got to be at least somewhat optimistic that Georgia got a chance to bend his ear one more time before the weekend and before he goes to Happy Valley. Georgia did indeed get its shot on that. One more thing about the recruiting weekend I want to make sure you're aware of, though, off the top of our program, was also something that Jeff Sintel wrote about on Friday. Mark Anthony Richards, that top 100 athlete, probably he wants to be considered a running back, maybe also a bit of a slot receiver, a kind of guy that Georgia could potentially use a lot of different ways. Jeff Sintel reported at DawgNation.com over the weekend that Georgia used got the final in-home visit with Mark Anthony Richards itself just a couple of days ago. So Georgia had a chance to entertain Richards in his own home and make another pitch to him as Richards goes into his final recruiting thoughts here, getting ready to make a decision really almost any time now the Richards decision could come, considering between Florida and Auburn. I guess Miami in the mix there too, Georgia in the mix there as well. Obviously, Mark Anthony Richards is still pretty torn on his decision. Let me give you an example of that, something that Mar, as some of the DawgNation forum readers have called him, what Mark Anthony Richards said to DawgNation.com about this. He says, I've just got to take my time, really seriously consider all these schools, and just pray about it. That's really all I can do. Wherever I go, I know it's going to be a great decision because I know all 5 of my schools are great schools, both athletically and academically, so I am good. So he says, I'm going to make a good decision wherever I go, but obviously he's weighing all this to make the best decision. When you think about what Mark Anthony Richards says there to Jeff Sintel, make some of the things that he said in the past about Georgia all the more interesting. This is a guy that's really gotten some level of comfort about the way that he thinks Georgia would use him if he were to join Georgia's 2019 class. In fact, that's one of the things that he wanted to hear most from Georgia. Would they make him a running back? Do they have big plans for him? Here is some of what he's told Jeff Sintel on that very point in the past.
How do you feel coming out of the This is my second time I know that they care about getting like Alvin Kamara. That's somebody he used to coach that family. So yeah, I rolled. I guess I can see myself playing.
So I think that's really that he likes the idea of being strictly a running back. Likes the idea of how Georgia would use him, and he went into a little bit more detail with Jeff about exactly what those plans would look like. Here's more from Mark Anthony Richards from a conversation in the past.
What did you like best about Georgia?
Just spending time with the coaches, Danny, due to I thought recruit me as but one time Coach Hankton visited, that's just what I am, and then from forward he kind of changed.
So that. Mark Anthony Richards. Now, I still have a hard time imagining how he would overall fit into a Georgia plans where it looks like you've got a guy in James Cook on the roster that already does a lot of the things that Mark Anthony Richards could do well at the college level. But Georgia obviously wants the best class it can get, the best players that it can get, best prospects. And certainly when you look at the overall rankings and ratings for Mark Anthony Richards, he certainly rates pretty high, so we'll see how that fits in. The bottom line is Georgia's got a limited number of scholarships it can still add in the 2019 cycle and a few big names it's chasing down. Kirby's told us he wants defensive backs. He'd like to have a wide receiver. And in the final stage of this 2019 class, Georgia's going to have a chance to get maybe a couple of the names I just mentioned. Kyra Lam still floating out there. Buckle your seatbelts because it could be a wild ride between now and Wednesday. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you. Thank you for being with us live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're also on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we're available as a podcast wherever you find podcasts, including the world-famous DawgNation.com, the Apple Podcast Player, the Google Podcast Player for the Android devices. We're just really glad to have you with us. Obviously, we will talk a lot about everything that's been going on with UGA. We'll get Chip Towers, our buddy, coming up in just a moment. Before that, though, as I promised, I did want to get into some of the Super Bowl stuff from last night. I want to do that as a part of Around the Doghouse here, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And there were really 2 questions that I was left with coming off last night's Super Bowl. When you look at one of the recipes for success for New England, and I think this ends up being a real relevant topic for UGA, look no further than David Boss Andrews, who is the Georgia alumnus, now playing in New England. He's a captain there, undrafted free agent, one of the captains of New England, one of the anchors. And here is a guy that went from being very lightly out of high school to a 3-year starter at Georgia, then went from being an undrafted free agent out of UGA to now being one of the pillars of the New England Patriots offensive line. So here are the 2 questions that I think would be relevant for a Georgia fan to deal with right now. How do you identify in a high school player now what Andrews had then? Or maybe a better question is, how do you coach that into someone? You know, a very popular phrase that exists right now is the notion of grit. The notion of wanting to fight and scratch and claw and get everything that you can. Maybe overcoming adversity, overcoming odds. Those of us who are parents want that for our children. But sometimes knowing how to instill that into your children is not easy to do. And sometimes as a coach looking to find players who are going to be the next version of David Boss Andrews. It's not easy to identify those guys at the high school level. Sure, you can find the guys who are bigger and stronger, and you can use measurements to determine the physical attributes, but those intangible attributes, and it's not just Andrews that has these. I think to a certain extent, Sony Michel has these too. Now, Michel was always an elite recruit and always kind of a superstar football player, but he's also kind of got that big game quotient. This is a guy who seems to rise his level of play to the highest level the bigger the moment is. New England for the NFL just seems to be really good at identifying those kinds of guys. It can pull a David Andrews out of the ranks of undrafted free agents. It can sift through the first round and find a guy like Michel who's going to thrive in the big moment. They just seem to be really good at that. And I don't really care about the Patriots for the most part. I don't really care how they do that. But I would love to also find a way to see Georgia be able to do that too. I'd love to also find a way for Georgia to, as it populates its roster with as many 5 stars as it can, be good at that intangible part of it as well, to say, here's the guy that really wants to play football, that really loves the game, that really wants to give it his all and his best every single time he goes out there. We actually had a chance to talk to David Boss Andrews about that when we were at last Monday at the Super Bowl opening night. Had a chance to discuss him about the path that he took to get to the New England Patriots, and I asked him flat out, hey, we're in a day and age now where most of the guys that play in your spot, offensive line at the University of Georgia, and these days and age, these are 5-star players. These are very high 4-star players. That's not what you were. Does that make you a different kind of football player? And I thought that Andrews gave a really interesting answer to that question. Here's what he said about that.
I don't think it makes me a different football player. I've just been the same David I've been my whole life. Tried to play with the same way I played when I was 6 years old. I think the love for the game, the passion for the game, the love for your teammates, that stuff's what carries you and what makes you a good teammate and good football player.
I think it'd be great to hear from some coaches. Andrews uses that phrase, love for the game, passion for the game. Can you really identify that? Is that the kind of thing when you go to a camp? Is it the kind of thing when you go to a high school football game on a Friday night? Can you really see the difference between guys who have that love and passion for the game and guys that don't? Obviously, in the case of David Andrews, that attitude has seemingly served him well to the point where now he is a starter for the New England Patriots, overcoming all the odds to be where he is. And if you're Georgia, you'd love to be able to find the next generation of that or be able to identify guys who have that demeanor. It seems to be a pretty valuable commodity, and New England seems to be pretty good at finding it. It's Around the Doghouse, here presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. They can help you equip your house with energy-efficient windows and doors. They're family-owned and operated, but they also have the strength of being a national company, so you really get the best of both worlds. You get the national strength, but you also get that locally owned branch right here in Georgia that gives you the service that you really need. And they also offer the best lifetime warranty and top-of-the-line equipment and unparalleled expertise. They have a great offer for you right now as well. You can get 40% off qualifying installations or 0% APR for 60 months. That offer is about to go away. It's only valid through February 7th, so take advantage of this right now. A couple different ways for you to do that. You can find them online at pellasoutheast.us. That's pellasoutheast.us. Or give them a call if they're Dunwoody Showroom. 404-445-2979. 404-445-2979. Pella Window and Door of Georgia. It's viewed to be the best. And that was not just a good weekend for Georgia in terms of guys contributing the Super Bowl. There's also a former dog that went into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. We'll talk about that later on the program. For now, though, here on DawgNation Daily, let's get ready to, as we do every Monday, welcome in our buddy Chip Towers right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Say hello to Chip Towers here on this Monday here around DawgNation. And obviously, Chip, there was a lot last night with the Georgia Bulldogs factoring into the story with the Super Bowl, as we talked about for the last few days. Kind of amazing to see so many former Dogs there in the center stage. And once again, it's New England who emerges as victorious. And listen, I'm no Patriots fan, Chip, but I have to admit I did enjoy seeing Sony Michel be as involved in this one as he was last night, scoring the game's only touchdown. And I briefly touched on this a moment ago. This is certainly a young man who seems to have, whatever that sort of big game gene is. I don't buy into the notion of being clutch all that much. I think that's an overused phrase in sports, but he showed it at Georgia in the Rose Bowl. He took his game to another level in the rookie season in the NFL. I want to say he had 6 touchdowns in postseason play this year, including a touchdown last night. There is something about big games that are certainly not too big for Sony Michel, and it's kind of cool seeing him carry that legacy with him on into the NFL after he showed that off also at the University of Georgia, too.
Well, and he's been consistent about it too, Brandon. I mean, when I think about Sony, I always think about the first stories I heard about him when he was just a freshman at Georgia from John Theus, who had gone against him in high school, and Sony, I think, was 4 years behind him or whatever, and he was a ninth grader come out of an American Heritage, and how he was just an unbelievable player. Even then. So he's been doing it for a long, long time. You know, everywhere he's been, American Heritage was a powerhouse program. Obviously, Georgia was a powerhouse program, and the Patriots, you know, what a dynasty become. I'm probably like everyone else. I'm like, you know, I'd like to see somebody decide to be to Alabama, but hey, you got to be happy for David Boss Andrews and Sony Michel and Isaiah Wynn as well. And, you know, the biggest thing about Sony, he just, in those moments, he just doesn't screw up, you know. I mean, it's easy to trip or drop the ball or something when in those big moments, and he just doesn't let it happen. 18 carries, 94 yards, a touchdown, and you know, really outshined Gurley on this particular night. Unfortunately, but good for the Patriots and good for Sony Michel.
And as I said before, I do believe the notion of being clutch is really overrated. It's the kind of thing those of us who do sports media for a living have a tendency to myth make about. But I do think there are players who don't like big moments as much. They'd rather run for 300 yards against Vanderbilt and score 5 touchdowns against the Commodores than be on that stage against the LA Rams and the biggest overall stage that football offers, because the nerves and the anxiety just diminish performance. Sony Michel does not seem to be one of those guys. He's never been, from my perspective, and Chip, you've obviously been around him for a long time, he's never been all that impressed with himself. He's never been all that impressed with what's happening around him. I had a chance to talk to him a little bit on Monday. He was kind of just taking it all in the way that he does everything else. And I do think he has a casual demeanor. I think that casual demeanor, if I had to guess, probably helps him in moments like last night where you got 100 million people watching on television, but for him, it's not that much different than it was in American Heritage back in Plantation, Florida.
Yeah, I think he does it. You know, he's actually very similar to Nick Chubb in that regard, and they're different in a lot of ways, but I think they both kind of influenced each other over the years, and they've got that kind of quiet confidence and, very intentional about not, letting any situation overwhelm them. And I loved his quote afterward. He says, "Be where your feet are." And right now, I'm at the Super Bowl. He said a wise man once told him that. That wise man was Kirby Smart. That was one of his go-to phrases: "Be where your feet are, and don't be kind of overwhelmed by the situation or thinking ahead or looking behind. Just be where you are right in that moment." And that's where he was. And beautiful, beautiful moment down there on the field with a Haitian flag wrapped around his shoulders, with his mom just beaming there behind him, and his dad there on the field tweeted out, "God is good." I mean, that's what you want to see. And what a proud week, for the University of Georgia, between everything you got from Gurley and Michel and Andrews and Rameek Wilson and Isaiah Wynn in the Super Bowl, and then Champ Bailey gets selected for a Hall of Fame induction. I got to say, Brandon, of all the athletes I've covered, and I've covered some great ones. Todd Gurley, one of the best running backs I ever personally got to witness on a day-to-day basis. Champ Bailey, just the best athlete I ever watched. I didn't get to see Scott Warner every day, and certainly Charlie Trippey and Jake Scott and some guys like that. But, man, Champ Bailey, you'd see him run 111 plays or whatever it was, in a game here and a game there. He gets inducted into the Hall of Fame, or will be inducted. Just a great weekend for the University brand. I don't know what kind of value they got out of it, but I think it was significant.
Yeah, I want to talk to you more about Bailey in a moment, because I think there are some really cool moments from his career that almost get lost to time a bit at the University of Georgia, and I want to address some of that with you in a minute. But you mentioned David Boss Andrews. I don't want to move off the Patriots before we talk a little bit more about him. And, Chip, one of the things I said before you joined us is, if I'm Georgia or just any football coach, I'm fascinated by stories like Andrews, and he's not the only guy that does what he does to go on to have NFL success, but it almost becomes this curiosity of, can you identify or can you train up someone to overcome their predictions the way that Andrews has? This is a guy that didn't have a ton of offers. This was not the 4- and 5-star offensive lineman that Georgia's recruiting now, and yet he became an invaluable member of the line as a 3-year starter at UGA. Now he's the captain of the New England Patriots. I'd love to think that one day there'll be some sort of football science, the way that everything else seems to grow and be developed, where coaches can kind of look across the plane of high school football and say, as Andrews said with his own words a moment ago, I love the game, I've got a passion for the game. If you can ever find a way to measure that, if you can ever find a way to really identify that, take what has up until now been intangible and turn it into more of a tangible thing, Chip, that's $1 billion idea, because that's the thing that all coaches are looking for and hoping to develop, but not everybody has that equally, and Andrews seems to have a lot more than most, does he not?
Yeah, he does, and I think this is part of the formula to the Patriots' success and Bill Belichick. I mean, if you read the stories about David Andrews and Bill Belichick's interactions with him prior to that draft, he flat out, you're not going to be drafted. We're not going to draft you, but we like what we see from you, and that's just fascinating to me. And I gotta be honest with you, I doubted David Andrews at every step. I mean, I remember when Georgia signed him out of the Wesleyan school, and I'm like, little private school over there in Gwinnett County, and who is this guy? And he every bit of 6'2", maybe, in an age when Georgia was playing 350-pound linemen, and granted, centers tend to be a little bit smaller.
Sure.
But I just never foresaw the success that he's had. But whatever it is, he's got that it factor. I mean, the guy knows football. He's been doing it since rec league over there in Gwinnett County. There's great stories. Friends of mine, actually, a buddy of mine, Rusty Bennett, had the pleasure of coaching him in youth ball, and then told me back then, said, he's just a player. There's just no way to really describe it. He knows the game. He loves the game. He's smart about it, and he's really quick. Now, he doesn't get, he's twitch quick, which is something you got to have as a center. But, recognition, quickness, and just a love of the game. And that's what David Andrews has. And right now he's got 2 rings, played 3 Super Bowls. That's just an incredible story. I can't wait to read his book when he writes it one day and find out what the secret sauce is to that kid.
This is not all that important, but it is kind of interesting to me that so much of the Todd Gurley story with the Rams last night reminds me so much of some of the DeAndre Swift stuff earlier in the season at UGA. He's not playing a ton. Gurley's not. He's not a big part of the Rams offense really in the Super Bowl or the NFC Championship game. And there's this kind of shrugging answer of, well, why not? Well, he says he's not hurt. It really reminds me a lot of the curiosities about the way that Swift was lightly used earlier in the season for UGA. What did you make of Gurley not being that big a part of this thing again last night after being really overshadowed in the NFC Championship game too?
Well, I still got to think he's got to be hurt. I mean, I don't care what he says or anybody else says. I think we all saw what Todd Gurley looked like all year. And the little bit that I saw of him, in the Super Bowl, NFC Championship game, he looked like the regular Todd Gurley. I mean, the one carry he had there bursted for, 8-9 yards. I don't know, a pretty good gain. 2 first down runs. I saw him. He looked like the same burst, same cut, the same vision. But you got to remember at the tail end of that DeAndre Swift story was a double groin surgery, right? And so, I mean, I think these guys nowadays, their careers are so precarious, running backs in particular. I think they're very, very careful about protecting, their personal rights when it comes to injury and that kind of thing. And I think he's just kind of keeping that on the down low. I mean, that's the only thing I can think, because the Todd Gurley I watched all season is not the guy I saw in the postseason. And certainly the Rams wanted that, they needed that, and they weren't able to get it. But then, the flip side of that, they weren't getting much on offense, period. I mean, give the Patriots credit. They did a great job of defending them, their offense in every way, shape, and form. And it was a struggle to get anything done, not just Todd Gurley.
Yeah, you're right about that. You mentioned Champ Bailey, and obviously you have great memories or vivid memories of his career at Georgia. And, Chip, I think one of the things that a lot of our younger listeners and viewers and your younger readers might not realize is how good of a wide receiver Champ Bailey was at Georgia. Obviously a terrific defensive back. He'll go into the Pro Football Hall of Fame as one of the best defensive backs in the modern era, a guy who was just a terrific ball hawk out there. But you go back and look at those late 90s Georgia teams that he played on, he was really lethal as a wide receiver coming across that, bubble screen, whatever you want to call that, that move that Bailey used a lot. He was a real load to deal with offensively. When I think back on Bailey and his Georgia career, I almost think back on him more as an offensive player than I do defensive player, even though he's an all-time great defensive back. He was just so difficult to tackle when he came across on one of those, receiver patterns, caught the football, take it to the end zone. He was really good in that spot.
Well, he was, and I give Jim Donnan a lot of for utilizing Champ Bailey the way he did. That tunnel screen, bubble screen, whatever you want to call it. I've never seen anybody run that play better than he did. And, really it was just sheer speed. He had unbelievable speed, but he had great ball skills as well as his career interception totals will tell you. And there was some discussion. I remember I went down to Folkestone and attended his draft party when he was picked. I think it was the 7th pick or 5th pick of that draft. That was a fun deal, a really crazy story that I'll tell you sometime off the air about flying down there in a single prop plane. But that's a whole nother story. But there was some talk, about that. Does he play on offense in the NFL? But obviously his skills were just so unbelievable as a defensive back and a cornerback, and that's where he concentrated in the NFL. And 11 Pro Bowls later, I think that was obviously the right call. But, also Champ, he just stayed as humble as you possibly could, and kind of, it was until they recounted all of his accomplishments in the NFL that you kind of forget. It's like, good Lord, look at the production that guy had for such a long time at that position. Now, you don't see cornerbacks hanging around for double-figure years usually in the NFL, and he was an unbelievable player. He's been a good Bulldog, and he talked about it being Bulldog country when he got that mention. I thought that was great. Champ's a great guy and another great representative of the University of Georgia.
I was going to try to avoid asking you about this for like the 5th week in a row, but I feel like I now have to. The more I think about it. On Wednesday, it's obviously National Signing Day. Kirby Smart will almost for sure address the players that Georgia adds and the overall mixture of how they fit into the class together. Do you expect on Wednesday Kirby to make the defensive coordinator situation official? It would seem really weird if he does it on Wednesday when he's likely to address the media. Does this long, statewide debate of how this is going to play out and who it's going to be in the role of defensive coordinator, does this all come to an end on Wednesday?
God, I hope so. I mean, I don't know. I kind of doubt it a little bit. I would anticipate like Friday or something, after all the National Signing Day and the residual, because you never know how all that stuff's going to come down on Wednesday. Georgia has so many, and you have gone over it in great detail with Jeff Sintel. This is kind of one of the most intriguing National Signing Days I've ever seen, especially when you're talking about possibly 2 or 3 spots. I don't know. Maybe there's some way that Georgia can finagle more in that, but there's so much intrigue about who are they going to actually get out of this class. Or it's kind of fascinating, and so you never know where that's going to go on Wednesday. He may use that platform to sort of solidify the entire staff, which now at this point includes 10 assistant coaches, and not anticipating any other trouble. But he also may separate the two, but I anticipate something this week. I mean, I think at this point, Kirby seems to me he's very much about the process. As we all know, he's very much segmental. And this would kind of be closing the door on recruiting, closing the door on staff, rebuilding, or what have you, and then getting ready and turning attention to preparation for spring practice. So I would imagine we'll have some announcements as to how everything's going to break down. I got a story on DawgNation right now on Dan Lanning. one way or another, I'm confident that Dan Lanning is going to be part of this equation. Whether Glenn Schumann, Charlton Warren, somebody else is also part of the equation, we'll find out. But, I dug a little deeper and tried to find out a little bit more about Dan Lanning. He's got a fascinating story about how he gets to the University of Georgia from little William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri. So that's a good read there, and you can learn a little bit more about him. But, when Kirby died, I think it'll be this week. I certainly hope so.
We will look forward to reading that from you at DawgNation.com to find out a little bit more about Lanning, who's obviously expected to potentially be a big part of all of this. So that'll be a fascinating read at DawgNation.com. Chip, thanks for your time here today on DawgNation Daily. As I said, we will look forward to reading you on the website and talking to you back here on the program again very soon, too.
All right. See you next time.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I look forward to that from Chip at DawgNation on Lanning. I've really grown to like Lanning as a coach. I think one of the things that Kirby Smart's been really good at is his ability to go out and find these young coaches and develop them. Or I don't even know if it's develop is the right way to say it. Just identify guys who are going to fit into his plans and fit into the mode that Georgia asks for its coaches to be in. You'll make the comparison to the situation of New England Patriots. It's been talked about over and over again that not everyone is a fit to play and coach with Bill Belichick. It is a grind. It is tough. It's not easy. I think a college version of that is a bit like what Kirby Smart does at the University of Georgia. And in this day and age now where there are a lot of coaches trying to do things in a similar fashion to Smart, the number of assistant coaches who can fit in that, thrive in that role, it's just not going to be a huge number. That's why you see so many of these assistants being passed around back and forth by the same SEC teams. It's kind of a finite resource. There aren't enough to go around. And so when Kirby Smart can go out and pluck a Dan Lanning and bring him in and bring him up through the ranks, do the same thing with a Glenn Schumann. I think you're seeing the same thing with Trey Scott a bit right now too. When Kirby's good at that, I think it benefits Georgia overall because you can't always go out and pluck a big-ticket, big-name assistant coach flip the way that Charlton Warren turned out to be when he left Florida and come from Georgia. That excites me. That excites fans. But the overall operation of a program requires more than just doing that because those kinds of coaches aren't always out there and available for you. I believe that Georgia's probably found a bit of a diamond in the rough with Lanning, and I look forward to reading more from Chip about Lanning at DawgNation.com. By the way, before we do our SEC through, let me remind you, and guys, you got to make sure you listen to this and pay close attention. Valentine's Day is coming up, and Kroger's got you taken care of on that. You can stop by your local Kroger from February 13th and the 14th, that's Valentine's Day, from noon to 6 p.m. for a chocolate dipping station. How about this? What a great date. Go to Kroger for the chocolate dipping station, and while you're there, you can also shop for everything you might need for your Valentine's Day. It's sweets, cards, flowers, everything in between, so you can do a lot of that kind of stuff. Get some strawberries dipped, whatever you need. I would imagine there's probably no shortage of things that would taste good dipped in chocolate, so do that. Take care of yourself and the significant other in your life. They're at your local Kroger. It's a really nice thing they're doing. All right, SEC through time, and here's the scenario with the calendar. Super Bowl is now over. That means we won't really have any kind of live football, no college, no pro, for quite some time. We got National Signing Day on Wednesday. Then after that, we really turn our attention to the start of spring practice. Now, the great news is that spring practice, you don't have to wait too long for that. That'll just be a few weeks down the road. And this is not just interesting from the standpoint of what Georgia's going to do in its spring practice, but what some of Georgia's biggest rivals are going to do. We talked last week in the program about ESPN. It's way too early top 25. It's reasons for optimism for all those. For Georgia, we addressed what they were saying with the Georgia defense. We debated last week about, is this a Georgia defense ready to take that next step towards really being a great unit, really being, more than just a good unit, but a impactful, game-changing, more sacks, more tackles for loss, and obviously ESPN weighed in on that. But as a part of our SEC through today, I also wanted to make sure we took some time to address some of the other things that ESPN said about some of Georgia's rivals. In the SEC, teams also ranked in ESPN's way too early top 25, the reasons for optimism for these teams, and how that might relate to Georgia in games that we know are going to be played or in games that could be played. First of all, starting with Alabama, it's probably not a huge surprise to hear the offense being mentioned. Tua Tagovailoa returns. Now, the opinion of Tua seemingly a little different at the end of the year than it was before the SEC championship, but this is still a very dangerous Alabama offense. That's true even without Mike Locksley and Dan Enos. Enos is at Miami now. Locksley's the head coach of Maryland. Steve Sarkisian's expected to be the offensive coordinator at Alabama. The overall results, I'm assuming for the Crimson Tide, aren't going to be all that different. Here's the one thing I would say, though, from a optimistic standpoint from Georgia. When you look at the way that Georgia defended Tua before Tua left that game with an injury, and it's so easy to forget this, in that SEC championship, DeAndre Walker also leaves that game with an injury, and he's been dealing with that ever since then, so much so that he's recently decided to have some surgery. When you think about that, you think about Georgia that had a winning game plan against Tungo Vailoa a year ago, or not even a year ago, it's last season, but it was in December, it's not all that long ago. So when you think about the Alabama offense coming back in a big way for 2019, we also know that Georgia's had a winning game plan against Tungo Vailoa. Yes, Georgia didn't finish the drill that day. That's water under the bridge now. But that is at least something to consider. ESPN also mentions the return of Joe Burrow as quarterback for LSU. I think this is one of the real interesting storylines in the SEC this season. As I've said before, I have been proven somewhat wrong on Ed Orgeron. He's building a better program right now at LSU than I would have anticipated in building. I'm higher on LSU going into the 2019 season than I would have been about this program going into the 2018 season. I think returning Burrow at quarterback, although I don't believe he's a great signal caller, but returning Burrow at quarterback, I think makes LSU a dangerous team. I've said I believe that both these freshman running backs, John Emery Jr. and Ty Davis, are part of the offense this season. LSU's already deep at receiver. This is as much of a challenge as Alabama's had in the SEC West in quite some time. I firmly believe that LSU is a legit, top 10 type team next season. I think that Texas A&M can be very much the same way, and I think this could make, despite the fact that Alabama's going to be a huge favorite and likely still going to win the division, they could be challenged within the division far more than they've been in quite some time. A couple other stories to mention. You got Kelly Bryant coming back to Missouri. ESPN wrote about that. On Friday, we dealt with the controversy of the bowl ban that Missouri's facing this season. The truth is, I don't think many players are going to leave Missouri because I think there's a chance that Missouri's going to appeal this, and by appealing that, they postpone whatever punishment might eventually come. Plus, there's just a really good chance, based on the facts on the ground, that Missouri's punishment ends up being lessened. I don't know enough about the NCAA process to know that, but I do know that Bryant, the former Clemson quarterback coming to Missouri, does make Missouri, if not a threat to win the East, a dangerous opponent on a single-game basis. Missouri coming to Athens this year, that's one of those games, much like in Columbia a year ago. Georgia knew it was in that game against Missouri, and I think they are good enough again this season to challenge on an individual game basis almost anyone. Do I expect them to beat Georgia? No, I don't. But with Kelly Bryant at quarterback, Derek Dooley at offensive coordinator, is that a competent team? Yeah, even with the NCAA sanctions hanging over its head, I believe that it kind of is. And then one more team to mention from the ESPN Way Too Early Top 25 look. They mentioned the Auburn defense. And I don't think you can put into words how much of a value it was for Auburn to get the good news from Derek Brown, coming back for his final season, not going to the NFL when I think almost everyone assumed that he would, likely could have been a first-round draft pick. As an anchor to that defense, Derek Brown as a defensive lineman for the Tigers next season, I think that ensures, at the very least, that the expectation is that Auburn should be a top 25 team next season. And this is one of those weird years in which they get to host both Georgia and Alabama. In 2017, we knew what a house of horrors that was for UGA. When you start thinking about those most important, most difficult games for Georgia next season, the 2019 season, I think you have to really think pretty closely about that trip to Auburn as a proving ground for Jake Fromm. Fromm struggled against LSU on the road in 2018, struggled against Auburn on the road in 2017. The road game in 2019 that's going to prove how much Jake Fromm has grown in that regard is likely going to be that game against Auburn. And Derek Brown's return makes that Auburn defense a very formidable foe for Georgia on that particular Saturday. So once signing day is done, we'll start turning our attention to the 2019 season in earnest. And there are some really interesting storylines already developing around the SEC, and I appreciate ESPN doing its part to chronicle some of those. We'll make that your SEC through. And I wanted to turn our attention a little bit more fully here to Champ Bailey, who I was really proud to see enshrined, or the announcement that he's going to be enshrined to the Pro Football Hall of Fame over the weekend. This is obviously deserving for one of the great modern-day defensive backs. A little bit different, I think, than a Deion Sanders, who, Sanders was one of those guys that his greatness as a defensive back was almost signified by the fact that people didn't throw his way very much. But Bailey seemed to be, in my mind, a much more impactful player on a game-to-game basis. This is a guy that got interceptions. This is a guy that really defended the ball incredibly well. And as we talked about with Chip Towers, when he was at Georgia, he was also a terrific wide receiver, too. He was used in some very creative ways by Jim Donnan. I know that Bailey's given some credit to Donnan for his college career, Donnan was really interesting how he used Bailey. And it was always really fun to watch. And obviously I've got great memories of that now that he goes in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And I'm thinking back to a couple of months ago when Bailey was with us in this program. And I thought it was really appropriate today, given the fact that we talk about this every single day, to remind folks about what the latest Pro Football Hall of Famer has said about Georgia and its rivalry with the Florida Gators. I do love this from Bailey so much. It was on the program with us. He looked back on a great memory of his being a part of a Florida team or a Georgia team in 1997 that upset Florida, that got that win. But listen to the end here with Bailey, making what I think is an irrefutable point. Georgia's biggest rivalry is with Florida. Bailey was really glad to go out and get a victory against the Gators in 1997. So here is the newest Pro Football Hall of Famer with some pretty important words for Georgia, looking back on a great win for himself against Florida and a reminder of how all Dog fans should view that rivalry. Take a listen to this.
There was a streak going of losing to them for several years, and to be able to break that streak, it was very meaningful. It was also meaningful in a way, my brother was on the field with me, Ron, and having all those great players, Hines Ward, Robert Edwards, Mike Bobo, and Kirby Smart as well. I mean, it was a great experience because it's hard to beat these guys. It was. But now I think we're in a different position, but people always have to understand, this is the biggest rivalry in college sports.
Listen, how much do you love that from Champ Bailey there when he was on DawgNation Daily not too long ago? First of all, there are a couple things I like about that. He says, it's hard to beat Florida. Then he pumps the brakes and says, well, it was hard to beat Florida. Not as hard for this Georgia team as of late, but certainly Bailey remembers that era in which Florida really meant something, and he was able to go out and get that win in 1997. And he also reminds us that Georgia-Florida, in his mind, is the biggest rivalry in all of college football. It's one of the things we try to hammer home on DawgNation Daily each and every day, that good Georgia fans ought to be Gator haters, and that's why we celebrate the fact that it's been 828 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten Georgia. Not quite as hard to beat Florida anymore, it would seem, and Georgia's been doing a lot of that as of late. We appreciate Champ Bailey being on DawgNation Daily not too long ago to celebrate that very fact. So if you're ever wondering how you should rank the rivalries that Georgia has, a Pro Football Hall of Famer just told you ought to value that Georgia-Florida rivalry, and that's plenty good enough for me. Congratulations to Champ Bailey. Congratulations to Sony and Boss Andrews. We'll see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily and on video. Thank you all for being with us, and I agree with what Chip Towers said on the program. What a great weekend it was. Great week it was for that UGA brand. Seeing Bailey go into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, seeing Sony Michel and David Andrews get a chance to celebrate the success they had. Obviously, not a weekend that Todd Gurley's going to want to remember, but his presence in the game can't be disputed. Ramig Wilson as well, who we had a chance to talk to last week. This was a good time for Georgia, and sometimes it can be really difficult to draw that line between what this weekend's going to provide UGA, the tangible benefit right away. It doesn't really work out that way. It's almost like your exercise routine. If you don't exercise today, you're not going to show any ill effects tomorrow. And if you do exercise today, it's not going to necessarily show any positive benefits just one day removed either. You can't draw a straight line to the tangible benefits or lack of benefits from a decision you make right now. It's just not the way it works. But the compound interest by showing up day over day, year after year, that really starts to pay off. And for Georgia, I think we are seeing some examples of that. I mean, I was at a Super Bowl party last night in my neighborhood, and somebody was jokingly saying, because they obviously knew I was a big Georgia fan, that living up north, moving down here, when you saw all those Georgia G's everywhere, and you've probably heard this before too, of, hey, is that the Green Bay Packers? Why are there so many Packers fans down here, not even really knowing what the Georgia G even meant? There was probably a time a few years ago when that was possible to do. It was probably possible to just not really know a ton about the Georgia football brand. But boy, the more you got Sony Michel's, scoring touchdowns in the Super Bowl, and Champ Bailey's going to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the more you have these kinds of things, these storylines regenerate themselves year over year, the more it becomes really hard to ignore that Georgia brand. And if the average random rank-and-file football fan finds Georgia unavoidable and impossible to ignore, the recruits are also going to feel the same way. And over time, it's just going to benefit UGA there in that regard. So at least something to think about for what Georgia's able to accomplish this week. Hard to say what it means specifically for right now, but impossible to deny that it benefits Georgia over the course of the long haul. Myra Herbert Bush says the Packers took the Georgia G. Mike Brown says news on 2019 recruiting. Mike, we did 10, 11 minutes on that off the top of the program. We can also reset that coming up here in just a moment, too, as Georgia heads towards its end on Wednesday. Justin Dowell also remembering back to those awful uniforms that Georgia wore in 2011 against Boise State. I guess that's in reference to the fact that on video we showed the Champ Bailey uniform from the 98 Georgia-Florida game when Georgia lost that game. Georgia wore the black pants. It's not a bad look necessarily. It's just not my preference for UGA. Ron Willard also saying something that I talked about earlier in the program, that Gurley's late season reminds me of Swift's early season. Healthy enough to play, but dinged up enough to limit the effectiveness. And I would also say denying everything all along the way. That's the other similarity between Swift and Gurley, is the fact that they both are completely unwilling to admit there's some sort of injury going on there. Eric Moody says, how insufferable has Connor been this morning? Connor has not been insufferable. Connor is a little different than your average Patriots fan in that most Patriots fans are totally loathsome and completely insufferable. Connor's not really like that. Honestly, he's been pretty mild-mannered all day long. He is obviously happy. His favorite team won last night. But I haven't had to, we haven't had to spray him with water or anything like that yet today. Kind of let people know that.
Yeah, when BJ came in and talked to us today.
BJ's one of the guys that works with us.
Said, yeah, it was a bad football game. Patriots didn't play well, but they came out with a win. I'm happy, I'm excited, but I'm not going around rubbing it in people's faces. Oh, we were doubted, nobody believed it. Like the Patriots, they're supposed to get into the playoffs. They're supposed to play in AFC Championship games.
As a Patriots fan, though, do you have an understanding for why some people are as tired of the Patriots as they were? Because it's really amazing to see, even like I said last night, my neighborhood party where you've got, varying degrees of football fandom in the room, but are a lot of people who just were really, really tired of the Patriots. It's amazing how that theme exists out there. As someone who likes the Patriots and is a fan of the Patriots, do you get the Patriots fatigue that exists?
I mean, people hate when, the same teams win all the time. It's, people hate the Warriors, they hate Alabama, but they'd give both arms if, Georgia won six Super Bowls in the span of 18 years.
Oh, yeah.
Played 9 national championship games.
Well, on that point, what frustrates me a little bit is I feel like there's already a good bit of Georgia fatigue out there for
it's
a team
coming.
but I feel like we're already getting some of that. There's already if you listen to like Tennessee fans, Florida fans, Auburn fans, they're already trying to act like, oh, I'm so tired of Georgia, so tired of this. Hey, Georgia just got here, and if you want to talk about the ultimate prize, Georgia's not even there yet. I feel like Georgia's getting the brunt of some UGA fatigue without actually enjoying the success that is usually commensurate for that kind of fatigue to set in.
So the fatigue is, if God forbid Georgia loses to Alabama again, the Georgia fatigue is going to be all the way there. No one will want anything to do with them. They're choke artists. They're, can't win the big one. Yeah. It'll be an unfair label because, they're losing to the best or second best team in the country every year, and 99% of teams would. But, I think, as Georgia continues to lose to Alabama, as it's now gone over a decade they've beaten Alabama in football, I do think that on a national scale is going to set it.
Yeah, I would say, and this is taking the conversation a different place than I intended to go, but right now in terms of that definition for Georgia, that label that Georgia's fighting back against, it's really got two things working against it right now. When you look at the Deep South and its rivals around the Deep South, Georgia's the only one without a national championship lately. You got the two ACC teams, Florida State and Clemson, who both won one within the last half decade. You've got seemingly every SEC team wrapped around Georgia. They've all won national championships recently. So Georgia's the one outlier there. And because of the rise of Clemson, Georgia seems to have that space to itself now and that going to let big game, big moments slip away. What Georgia did against Alabama in this year's SEC championship. What happened to it in last year's national championship. Right now, Georgia does not have a lot of company in that world when it comes to college football. Fairly or unfairly, that's the narrative that exists when it comes to UGA. Now, I think guys like Sony Michel did fight back against that. You can't say that they didn't perform really well and really big in a Rose Bowl scenario against a Heisman Trophy winner Baker Mayfield, but people, especially those who have an agenda against Georgia, I mean rank and file fans, are going to use the Alabama game as more paramount in memory than the Rose Bowl and what happened against Oklahoma. So Georgia is definitely going to have to fight back against some of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Mike Brown on our Facebook comment section said, I was late. Can we rehash some of the recruiting stuff? So Connor, you're with me right now. Let me try to just run through all of this. It looks like, based on some Instagram stuff, that indeed Nick Cross did take an unofficial visit to Georgia over the weekend before going to Penn State. Georgia had a chance to plant one more seed in his mind, make one more impression on him. I think that is valuable and important. Obviously, you'd have loved to have been in that position for that official visit over the weekend. Georgia wasn't that, but getting a chance to have him on campus for a couple of minutes before he goes to Happy Valley, that certainly means something to me. Georgia also, according to Jonathan Mingo's Twitter feed, hosted the 4-star receiver, current Ole Miss commit. That's obviously not the same caliber of prospect that George Pickens would be, but it certainly appears to be a little bit less complicated of a recruitment overall. As I mentioned before, if you gave me a choice between Mingo, the 4-star incoming freshman, or Lawrence Cager, a graduate transfer from Miami, who put up some stats in a Hurricanes uniform, even if he wasn't always as good as some Miami fans wanted him to be, I'm taking the grad transfer over the high school freshman, or I should say high school senior incoming freshman in that regard. There's also what Jeff reported about Mark Anthony Richards, top 100 talent, athlete, kind of a hybrid running back, wide receiver, wants to be thought of as a running back, but in all reality, I think he's only a part-time running back at best at Georgia. Georgia goes in-home with him, gets the last in-home visit with him before the weekend. Anything else, Connor, you want to mention from a recruiting standpoint that I have not mentioned that's probably worth discussing here? I guess Brett Seither was supposed to go to Penn State this weekend, the tight end. I'm assuming he probably did.
From what I have heard, he has canceled that visit.
He didn't go to Penn State?
Yes.
I didn't know that. That's pretty interesting.
He will announce his decision at 1:30 on Wednesday. He figured that out this morning. Another bit of news, if you're sort of into reading this, DeAndre Francois got kicked off of Florida State's team. It was a school that is interested in John Rice Plumlee as a quarterback.
That's good.
So
that's not good that happened. That's a good point to bring up.
Yeah, it's something to sort of keep an eye on. I'm going to give you my dream Georgia signing day scenario, or signing day shortly thereafter scenario. Georgia lands Kyrie Elam. They get Lawrence Cager from Miami as a transfer. I'm not sure if he's going to count towards the 2019 scholarship count or the 2020 scholarship count.
How is this so hard to figure out?
It's the NCAA.
I feel like this ought to be a little easier for those of us who've devoted our life to knowing as much about college football as we can. This ought to be a little easier to understand than it is.
And then John Rice Plumlee comes as a picture. That is my dream close for Georgia on signing.
You want to see John Rice Plumlee still be a part of this?
That's what I don't think that's what we're gonna get. But that is what I want.
Mike Anderson says, does Georgia really need Jonathan Mingo? And I guess that's what Connor's also alluding to here as well. That, listen, I think Georgia needs a receiver. I'd prefer it be a graduate guy, a transfer guy, than Mingo right now. I don't think Mingo's a bad prospect, but I don't know. I think if you bring in Cager, and I know some of y'all are going to think I'm exaggerating on this, but if you bring in Cager, I think you would have a chance to be in the conversation for that top 2 or 3 receiver performer for you for 2019. That's not what Jonathan Mingo is going to be, and therefore if Mingo's not going to be that, now you're comparing him to what you could get in 2020. And I'd hate to think by taking Mingo late, you're blocking the chances of getting probably a better overall prospect in 2020. So that would be my preference. Go graduate transfer right now, bring in a veteran who maybe have a chance to come in and play for you, and then really look to load up. And, the stuff that A.J. Green said on Friday, find a way to really broadcast that message of 5-star receiver, NFL All-Pro, says, yes, come to Georgia, take advantage of single coverage, show how great you are in what ought to be mismatch opportunities. How do you broadcast that message? How do you get that out of the class of 2020? Because clearly, with the exception of Dominic Blaylock, who I'm obviously still very high on, but with the exception of Dominic Blaylock, that message didn't work in 2019. Can Georgia re-up that in a more aggressive, favorable way for 2020? That's what I'm hoping to see Georgia do.
I have a question for you.
Please.
Sort of shifting gears here a little bit. Kyrie Elam talked about a lot. He's probably the biggest fish out there for Georgia still. George Pickens is a separate issue. Georgia misses out on him that almost certainly means he's going to Florida.
Yeah.
Where would that rank for you, number one Gator hater, in terms of recruiting misses in the Kirby Smart era?
That's a good question. I would say that it's definitely a miss. Now we can get into because I think before you say where does it rank as a miss, I think you have to get into what is a miss and what's not.
Right. Or a loss. Maybe not a miss so much as.
Well, I'm gonna say a miss in terms of a swing and a miss. You took a shot at Elam and you missed.
Yeah.
Not missing on the evaluation, but you went after Elam and you didn't get him. That's a true miss.
Yeah.
For instance, you can debate if Rick Sandage last year was a miss or not.
Yeah.
You know, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Maybe Georgia didn't have as much room as it wanted. Maybe Sandage flat out told Georgia no. There's probably some room to debate that. If Georgia doesn't get Elam, that's a pretty clear miss to me. It's a guy they really went after and did not get. And losing him to Florida, even though he's got the family ties to the University of Florida, I think that'd be a pretty bad miss. I think that's Georgia taking an L right there. There haven't been a lot of examples where Georgia's taken L's to Florida in recruiting in really quite some time, but this would be one. This would be an example of that. And it would seem to be Florida using its family tie and using its DBU brand, and they've certainly had a pretty good collection of defensive backs. They would be using that to their advantage. So the one thing you won't hear me do, and sometimes people like this and sometimes people don't, but you won't hear me come on the air on Thursday and say, hey, have no fear. Georgia got everybody it really wanted, and Kyrie Lam going to Florida, that's because Georgia didn't really want him in the first place. I'm not going to do that there in that regard. My understanding is that Georgia really wants Kyrie Lam. My understanding is that they've really thrown out the aggressive pitch for Elam. If Elam chooses Florida anyway, I think on Thursday you have to call that what it is. That's a swing and a miss. That's an L for Georgia, and it'd be one of a couple in this 2019 recruiting class. Jonathan Wilson says Elam's not coming. Drew Roman says the same thing. I certainly know there are a lot of people out there that feel very strongly that Florida has maintained its edge with Elam despite the Charlton Warren hiring, despite the the best foot being forward and all the assumption on the official visit. There's a lot of negativity from Georgia camps about Kyrie Lam. I'm forced to wait and see on that. I don't have any inside information to offer you on that. But there's certainly no shortage of Florida fans who hit me up to say Elam's coming to Florida. There's no shortage of Georgia fans who say I don't really feel all that good about Kyrie Lam. That's certainly fair to point out, and it's worth mentioning here. If he indeed does go to Florida, I believe that's Georgia taking an L right there. Not the kind of loss you can't overcome,
right.
But it's Georgia taking an L.
What I'm really not looking forward to is if Elam does pick Florida, they're going to celebrate letting him like it was the goal line stand.
Right. And the otherwise 19-point victory for
and the otherwise massive Georgia recruiting victory. It'll just be something Florida fans will tout like it's an actual.
Drew Roman says, I would want Nick Cross over Kyrie Lam if I could pick. I don't really have an opinion on that one way or another. Connor, do you have an opinion on that?
Not really. I think Elam's more of a pure corner, whereas Cross is probably a safety. And, we've talked a lot about just, have true corners, get true.
Yeah. Here's the other thing, though, and I believe that wholeheartedly. If it's a win that Florida is going to celebrate, if Georgia gets it, it's also a win that Georgia should be celebrating too. Because
both ways.
The one thing we've seen from Georgia is that Kirby Smart really values these defensive backs. I'm talking about big numbers. I joke all the time about the number of defensive backs that Georgia signed for its 2017 class. Went out and really brought in a lot of those. Georgia values those defensive backs, wants to attack that issue with huge numbers. And, these elite guys, these guys that could be in the rotation, that could be competitors, if Georgia's able to get another one of those in Kyrie Lam, it's a win that Georgia ought to celebrate too. So what I don't want is this to be a scenario where if Florida gets him, as Connor said, they're parading around like it's the goal line stand. And if Georgia gets him, it's a ho-hum. Why didn't we get George Pickens? I hope that Georgia fans will also take a moment to celebrate what has been a very contested recruitment down to the wire. And, I even said this in the show the other day. I have not given Florida a lot of credit on this show over the last couple of years. I think a lot of people assume that's just because I'm so biased I can't say anything good about Florida. But there have been a couple of times over the last couple of weeks where I have paused to say, you know what? I think Florida's doing a pretty good job in making a pretty strong pitch to Kyrie Lam. They seem to be a real factor here. They seem to be a worthy adversary in this recruitment. So even someone like me has got to admit they're a little bit more of a factor than I'm typically used to them being over the last 4 years. Dana Swain says, I think we get Cross and Elam. Kirby knows what he's doing. If Kirby could get both those guys, given what I think I know about Kirby Smart, I don't think he's worried about anything else if he gets those two right there.
No, not at all.
I think he's taking those two defensive backs and he's patting his assistants in the back and he's moving on. Lamar Lovelace says, "B.A., you didn't mention the preferred walk-on running back from New Jersey today. What we'll do tomorrow with Jeff is we'll try to get a collection, because I meant to do this with him last week. Just try to get a collection of all the preferred walk-ons as we know them now and address all of that. We'll do that." Drew Roman says, "Who is a surprise recruit we could land?" Boy, I don't know if there's any surprises left out there. I mean,
Jeff Santella's done such a great job of identifying guys. It's hard for anyone to really be a surprise.
And in addition to that, there are just not that many recruits left. So it's
exactly,
like,
yeah.
At this point in time, we've turned over every stone, I think. I mean, I guess despite what Mark Anthony Richards told DawgNation on Friday, I'm still going to be surprised if he joins the Georgia class.
I would agree.
You know, he certainly seems to like Georgia, and there's plenty of reasons to like Mark Anthony Richards, but to me, this has never felt destined to end in a marriage. So I guess if that were to happen, that'd be a surprise. But by our typical definition of surprise, that probably wouldn't qualify because there's been so much written and talked about with him on that. So that would be a surprise in terms of the outcome. But in terms of like a plot twist of, oh my gosh, look at this, I just don't really see that out there for Georgia all that much, because by this point, you know, for instance, an example of a surprise would be Darnell Wright. You know, Kirby Smart said they wanted another offensive lineman, but Wright hasn't visited Georgia. That ship has completely sailed. So anybody that would have kind of classified as a surprise, there's just so little connecting them to Georgia now that it's not even probably even worth, you know, mentioning. You know, Doug Nestor would have been that guy at one point in time too, and that's obviously moved on, and that's changed now as well. Let me go over to YouTube because I have not been here all day long, and there's no telling what they're saying about me over there.
I'm about to give you hell for that one.
Oh my gosh, there's no telling what they're saying. K9 Blue says, I've watched tape on Elam and Cross. I think it's funny that autocorrect turned that into across. And watch Cross at Army All-American game. And Cross is a stud. Honestly, I would take him over Elam. Kid is a dog, therefore making him perfect to be a DAWG dog. So there you go, K9 Blues watching both these films pretty close, and he likes Cross a lot. So take that for what it's worth. Good analysis by K9 Blues. Cliff Payne says the defensive back hire may have got Nick Cross back on board more than Elam. Let's see what happens, but it wouldn't shock me. I mean, what do you say about Charlton Warren at $600,000 if he doesn't get either one of these guys?
Tough look, but I will also say, so, you know, Trey Scott, we talked a lot about him and his recruiting chops early on. I think, you know, you have to give him some time. And, you know, not that this is necessarily great news, but Warren was the primary recruiter for right now for Florida's top players signed in its class.
Yeah.
So, you know, he clearly showed that on a staff that doesn't have great recruiters at the moment for Florida, he at least showed he was top.
And my thing on Warren is, and I brought this up during the show, and I don't know if this resonates with people or not, but I would love to see Georgia find a way to either identify or cultivate whatever it is that David Andrews has. I mean, whatever that thing of, hey, I'm going to go out and prove you wrong about me. That fight, you know, that somebody said, that dog in you. Andrews seems to have that. And I'd love for Georgia to have a lot more of that. I'm not saying it doesn't have it right now. I just like, for whatever that thing is, I'd like for Georgia to have more of that. Connor, I have to believe that an Air Force veteran like Charlton Warren has got to be at least a little bit good at seeing that in somebody else and bringing that out of somebody who may have it in them but lying dormant. And I know that may sound, I don't know what, but it takes a lot to do what Charlton Warren's done in his life.
Yeah.
So whatever that is, there would seem to be some crossover with this thing of I'm gonna play at 150% of my capabilities, because somehow, some way, that's what David Andrews has done for his entire life.
Yep.
Whatever his ceiling is, he's played at 150% of that for his entire career. He's a 3-year starter at Georgia. Did he even have? I mean, was he even rated? Does he even have? I mean,
he was a 3-star.
But we're not talking about the 4- and 5-star guy right now, and not a guy that had just like, you know, tons and tons of offers necessarily. at the high SEC
Right.
level, right? So
Number 8 center in the country in his high school class.
So he goes on to be a 3-year starter at Georgia, undrafted free agent, as Chip Tower said. Bill Belichick looked at him and said, I know for a fact you're not going to get drafted. And then he goes on to now being the captain of the New England Patriots. I just feel like that Charlton Warren over the long haul is going to be the kind of person that can maybe bring that out of more Georgia players and identify Georgia players who could also do some of that kind of stuff. And I'm not telling you I want to see Georgia start, recruiting a bunch of 3-stars. That's not what I'm saying. But when you can find the 4- and 5-star guy who has a chip on his shoulder as if he were a 3-star, I think really good things are going to happen. Over the course of the long haul, I believe that Charlton Warren may be the kind of guy that can do some of that for UGA.
So 2 things to your point. It would be great if we could easily identify, David Andrew types. But I think a lot of that is just who he is as a person and something he was born with. It's not necessarily something you can develop over time. I don't necessarily believe you can develop into being a great leader. You either are or you aren't, and it's okay if you're not. As far as finding that 5-star, 4-star guys with chips on their shoulder, I don't know if those exist. I mean, the chip on your shoulder guys, the 3-star guys, they're overlooked, quote unquote, but you'd much rather have a 4-star and a 5-star guy than a 3-star guy in your roster. It's just, if you look at team building national championships, that's how it is, my high school coach always used to joke, if I could have 11 Connor Rileys, I'd take it in a minute. And I was always just respond back, well, our team would be 0-10 and we'd be terrible if that were the case. So, you do have to find that balance. You don't want, too many cooks in the kitchen, too many leaders, too many guys that are, fighting for control in the microphone.
Yeah.
So, sometimes
fair point.
You do need a David Andrews, and then other times you need, a John Theus, a Colton Houston, Greg Pike, so guys who, are capable of saying, hey, that's our guy, we're going to follow him, and he's going to be our leader.
Fair point. I think it's a very fair point. K9 Blues, to go back to the subject of Elam, says, B, I don't see how you can say missing on Elam would be a huge L, meaning loss. He's from Florida, and Florida has had him at the top of their board. It'd be a huge W if we got him an L for Florida, but not vice versa, So that's what K9 says. That's a fair point. I'm sure many people agree with K9. Here is my rebuttal to that. This is the battle that Georgia has chosen to fight. Georgia has chosen to recruit nationally this year and seems to be choosing the same thing in 2020. So when you go into somebody else's state, Florida included, you are going to be a bit of a point spread underdog. You are making the decision to overcome those odds by going there. Georgia was never really in on Andrew Booth. That's an in-state defensive back that Georgia could have had. Georgia has chosen to prioritize. I'm not saying it didn't want Andrew Booth. I'm just saying that, given the way all things worked out, given the choice of in-state guys or out-of-state guys, Georgia's chosen to pursue out-of-state guys. So when you do that, you have to assume they're going to have ties other places. So, Connor, I'll let you weigh in on this, and other commenters can as well. I'll pop back over to Facebook for this. You can't say, little old Georgia was always going to be in for a tough fight with Kyra Lam as it is. That's the guy you chose to go after. Yep. It's the same thing with John Emery Jr. in Louisiana. You can't say, well, it's hard to pull kids out of Louisiana. You knew that before you started recruiting him, and you chose to make that your running back priority for a while. So I'm not going to let Georgia off the hook on Elam, despite the fact that he's got, family ties, former Florida players, and he's an in-state guy there. That's the guy you chose to recruit.
Yeah. I will say, and I think one other reason I would consider this maybe a loss for Georgia is, as opposed to John Emery, yes, in some ways it's an L because he was committed, but, Georgia and LSU were recruiting him equally, and he just happened to pick LSU at the end. Georgia, there's a good chance Georgia never sees John Emery on the field in a game against them. With Elam, you're going to see him every year.
Yeah, you're right.
He's a guy you're going to have to play against every year. So, with guys like that, I do think that when it's down to a school you face every year, in Auburn, a Tennessee, a South Carolina, Florida, wherever, even at this point in Alabama with the way things are trending, those losses sting a little bit more than, say, just a guy who you're not going to see play against Georgia in college.
Yeah. Bruce Eklund in our Facebook comment section has a funny response to Elam being a Florida guy and therefore more likely to go to Florida. He says the state of Florida now has become Baja, Georgia. This is a very obscure joke, but I kind of get it.
I like that a lot.
Yeah. That Florida's Baja, Georgia. Now it belongs to Georgia. I think that's really funny. It is really funny from Bruce Eklund. I like that. Drew Roman says Andrew Booth, Morris, Hazelwood, Popo, Watson, all should be dogs. And I do have to say, if you want to talk about L's, and Connor said, where would losing Elam rank for you in terms of misses for Georgia? hard to dispute that Jaden Hazelwood's not the biggest that Georgia's had since Kirby's been there. I mean, I guess I kind of agree with Roman on that. The Booth thing, I just don't understand that. I mean, he seems like a great player, and it just never gave a rip about Georgia one way or another. I don't know what you do about that when being an hour from Georgia's campus didn't seem to be a factor in that recruitment whatsoever. So I can't get as mad about Booth as I would want to because it doesn't seem like Georgia ever had a chance there. But the Hazelwood thing, there's no doubt that's a loss. It's just a loss for Georgia.
I don't know about all time for under Kirby Smart. I think missing out on Derek Brown in 16 is tough. Aubrey Solomon in 17.
Yeah.
But those are probably the top three, I would say.
Yeah. Jamel Major says we have a ton of DBs. I'm not viewing the Elam thing as a loss. I think the issue here, though, is when you look at what you have to face with Alabama in the SEC championship, Jalen Waddle and Jerry Jeudy and Devontae Smith and Henry Ruggs, even the tight end's a guy you have to think about from a defensive back standpoint a little bit. When you think about all those weapons, Tua throwing the football, I think you need as many defensive backs as you can get, and therefore you want the competition to be as intense as it can be to find those guys. I mean, really, Eric Stokes right now is a better player than his recruiting profile told you that he should be. Based on what we've seen from him on the field, he's outperforming his recruiting profile. So in a way, you've actually gotten a little lucky. Replacing Campbell with a guy like Stokes and having Stokes pay off the way that he did, you've actually gotten better production from him than you were supposed to. So you can't count on that every single time. You do have to stockpile the Stevensons and the Elams and the guys like that, what you hope DJ Daniel turns out to be. You got to stockpile those guys so that you can have the competition emerge where you can lock down on Jeudy. You can lock down and have somebody run with Jalen Waddle, something that I'll admit I didn't see anybody doing in the SEC championship game. The thing that blew me away in December more than anything else was how good Jalen Waddle is. I thought that Waddle was just a complementary piece to what Alabama was doing. And I guess he didn't have, that great of a college football playoff, all things being equal. But he was a real factor in the SEC championship, an incredibly difficult guy to defend. And therefore, if you're Georgia, and especially Kirby Smart, he just views life this way. He wants as many defensive backs as he can because he knows to win a national championship, the same way that I always talk about Georgia needing its game-breaking wide receiver, Kirby knows the pathway to that is Alabama and Clemson and Oklahoma and all of its game-breaking wide receivers, that stopping those guys is going to be a major factor. I mentioned this last week. Go back and read what Bill Connelly wrote at footballstudyhall.com about the value of just really good experienced secondaries, that when it comes to predicting success in a football season, there's virtually nothing that determines that more so than the ability to knock passes out of the air, and you need good defensive backs, talented defensive backs to be able to do that against teams that want to pass. And that's why I think Georgia needs as many of these Kyra Lam-type players as it can get. And, we'll have to sort of see what's happening. Now, Bruce Eklund says Kirby Smart knew that Eric Stokes was real, even if we didn't, and maybe that's the case.
Two things. So one, watching the Super Bowl last night, the two biggest defensive plays were Jason McCourty breaking up, what looked to be a sure touchdown pass in the third quarter, and then Stephon Gilmore's interception. To your point about you just have to have defensive backs who can get their hands on the football. And to the Stokes point, and this sort of goes with the David Andrews point as well. You want to be a program where you can find these guys who Eric Stokes was a surprise. I don't think anybody expected him to play as well as he did. Same can be said with David Andrews. But you don't want to be counting on those guys when they're coming into the program to be long-time bona fide starters.
That's not a recipe for success.
No, that's not a long-term recipe for success.
So Philip Jordan Wells says that Nick Cross cut his Penn State visit short. Is that? I don't know that. Is that true?
It's the first time hearing of that.
Here's what would scare me about Cross, and I hate to be cynical, but Florida State really needs some good news. It has been a rough stretch for Florida State as of late. DeAndre Francois, whatever happened there on Super Bowl Sunday, they announced that he's leaving the program because of what is allegedly a pretty ugly situation in his personal life with some domestic violence type whatnot. This is a Florida State program that needs some good news. I don't know how many guys they have a chance to sign on Wednesday. The truth is I haven't been paying that close of attention to what's been going on there. But having a chance to hold on to a Nick Cross would be a really nice piece of good news in Tallahassee, which maybe makes me think that they're going to turn the heat up on him even more. So if it is indeed true, and I don't know it to be true, Philip apparently does, that Cross cut his Penn State visit short, I think that's as likely to benefit Florida State as it does benefit Georgia.
I would agree with that.
Lamar Lovelace says Cross is coming. Listen, I'd be more than happy to welcome him into Athens for sure. We're going to get ready to go here in a minute. Good comments as always. K9 Blue says Stevenson and Elam are close friends and have openly said they want to play together, so getting Stevenson only helps us with Elam. I think that's probably true. These defensive backs seem to like to play together a little bit. GB2 says, BA, we're not worried about helping other teams. We need UGA recruits and the best. I don't know if that's a reference to what I was saying about Florida State a moment ago. I don't want to help Florida State. I'm just saying that Florida State may be trying to help themselves here. Bulldog Chris also says Stokes is a true DGD. Yeah, no doubt. He really is. Really is. Dennis Wilson says, chalk it up, picking signs with Miami. I haven't heard that one. 100% committed fax machine will settle everything. I've heard about every other school before him but Miami, but we'll see how that goes. Richard Lumpkin says, what's the broadcast story going to be on Wednesday? We're going to figure all that out, and we'll have some more announcements for you coming up on that. Also, someone chimes in from the DawgNation account. I'm assuming this is Mike Griffith to say that the Eli Wolf watch is going to continue past National Signing Day. So pay attention for that going on for a while here as Georgia potentially looks to add a transfer tight end in Eli Wolf in addition to everything else that's going to be going on. So we shall see about all that. Chevron Hannah says, did we sign a defensive coordinator yet? No, Chevron. That still hasn't happened, nor may it ever happen. There is just a good chance that this just never gets announced, and for the rest of our lives, we're left wondering
who's
actually calling the plays for Georgia
defensively. The New
defensively.
England Patriots did not have a defensive coordinator this year.
Uh-huh.
Brian Flores was the defensive play caller, but he was a linebacker coach. There was no title given out to defensive coordinator, and, Saban is of the Belichick tree, and so, technically Kirby Smart is a, Bill Belichick disciple through some distance. Wouldn't surprise me at all if Kirby just says, yeah, no, we're not going to name a defensive coordinator now. But in all likelihood, I think there's a very good chance, based on what we saw at Sugar Bowl, with Lanning being on the field next to Kirby, calling out defense, talking to guys, that he is the defensive play caller and maybe not the defensive coordinator.
Yeah, I think that's interesting to think about, and I hate to turn this into like a media thing, but do you think there's a chance that Kirby doesn't do a press conference on Wednesday?
I could see it.
Because on December signing day, he only did a post-practice press conference. If memory serves. He didn't do the, hey, we're really glad about our class, and we welcome all these guys in. If memory serves, he did not do a fancy...
Well, so part of that, though, was because Georgia had guys that were signing later in the day.
Well, the real reason was Justin Fields, but...
that's, yeah. If he could have had his way, he wouldn't have said anything to the media that day.
So you almost wonder if, like I said, the average fan doesn't care about this anyway, but that's the way that you would get some potential resolution in this one way or another, is in typical fashion, coaches should speak on National Signing Day on Wednesday. Kirby would obviously be asked about that, and I'm almost more fascinated with the reason for not announcing it yet, more so than if he were actually to go ahead and, Dan Lanning is our defensive coordinator. If he just sort of drops that in, I'd almost be more fascinated for listening for his reasoning for not doing it yet. But if he's not ready to make the announcement on that one way or another, my guess is that maybe he punts on the signing day press conference.
I could certainly see that, especially if, Kaiir Elam doesn't sign with Georgia and, Brett Seithert chooses Alabama and Georgia doesn't sign anybody on Saturday.
Let me finish with this. Cliff Payne says, Javon Shepard, any chance there? I guess that would rate. We talk about what would count as a signing day surprise. I guess that Shepard would certainly count as a signing day surprise. He did take a recent visit to Georgia. That visit seemed to go well, but I'm assuming this is a Texas versus Texas A&M battle for Javon Shepard. I think both those teams need him a lot, and if I've done the math correctly, which I probably haven't, I think there's a chance that Javon Shepard could end up being the difference between Texas and Texas A&M being ranked above each other, right? Yep. That there's a chance that could be the swing player in terms of which of those teams, Texas or Texas A&M, gets the number 3 class in the country. So I'm guessing he stays in state one way or another. Is that your understanding of that situation?
Yes, from what I've read and heard.
All right, so we'll do our part on all of this. Hashim Spike says Kirby's the defensive coordinator, and obviously Kirby is a great defensive mind, and if you're ever on the sideline, Connor watches every game on the sidelines. I'm on the sideline some. You definitely see example of Kirby's, I don't know if it's savant-like, that may be taking it too far, but that engagement, that deep level of engagement he has with what the opposing offense is doing, he's really good at that. And despite even though that's true, you don't want that to be the only pair of hands you have in that role. You want somebody else creating that game plan, bringing it to you, and letting Kirby Smart tweak it or be involved with it. However, you don't want him creating it from scratch because that's just too much for one guy to do. So despite the fact that Kirby Smart is heavily involved in the defensive game planning, I'm assuming, I still think having a defensive coordinator is a really important thing. Jacob Thompson, this is a good point. For better or for worse, this is probably true. He says, well, from what I can tell about Kirby, everyone asking about the defensive coordinator just makes him want to reveal it less. And there's one thing I think we can all agree with is that is probably true. So we will get ready to go for today. One way or another, we will have a lot of fun covering all this in the days ahead. We will be doing some extra stuff on Wednesday. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what all that's going to be, but we'll be doing some extra stuff on Wednesday, and we will be following all of this defensive coordinator stuff and wherever that goes. And really, as I mentioned before, also getting ready for spring practice right around the corner. So a lot to do and a lot of fun stuff, and it's going to be a great time. So we appreciate that, and we'll look forward to seeing you all back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for another episode of DawgNation Daily Live. Y'all have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you then.